Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk through my practicum in Genentech's U.S. Medical Affairs group, particularly the ophthalmology group. Um, the practicum overview. So I worked in the ophthalmology team. It's a group of physicians and scientists who are studying sight and how that impacts patients with retinal disease. Essentially, they're answering a lot of clinical questions, a lot of post-marketing studies to essentially get information out there to clinicians so that they can perform or provide the best care to patients. Uh, my scope of work was one of the main objectives was to develop a broad-based study examining the patients with diabetic macular edema and diabetic retinopathy in the U.S. That's how we began. Um, I started getting up to speed by doing one-on-one sessions with the ophthalmologist to get some of the medical science terminology to become more fluent. You can see a diagram of the org structure within the group. Eventually, it culminated into my primary project. It took a while to identify this project, but I ultimately delivered a comparison of patients with diabetic macular edema and diabetic retinopathy using different medical databases, medical claims databases, namely MarketScan and the Medicare Supplemental Database. Some background about the primary deliverable was for Lucentis, ranibizumab, which is indicated for the treatment of patients with diabetic retinopathy with DME, diabetic macular edema. The team is also looking to file an sBLA to gain approval for use in diabetic retinopathy patients without DME. So they currently have with DME, they're looking to gain the indication without. And they needed to do some sort of comparison of these two different patient populations. And so I was tasked with creating a non-interventional study, which involved a retrospective database analysis of these two different cohorts, where I examined administrative claims databases, again, Truven and Medicare, to determine a difference, or at least to compare the two populations, the two cohorts. So the research objective is to study or to compare the Charlson Comorbidity Index between DR patients with and without DME. So the Charlson Comorbidity Index is a method using International Classification of Disease ICD diagnosis codes in these medical claims, which using a weighted score for an individual patient can take a number of mortalities that are coded and create an index score that relates to a predictive one-year mortality. So it, in essence, is able to take a patient with a listing of mortalities and or morbidities and determine a one-year mortality figure. And that's helpful in determining how, as a patient population, how sick are these patients. Study design, again, it's a retrospective database analysis using US patients that have diabetic retinopathy, some with DME, some without. There's a number of variables we studied from the two different data sources. The study size was a convenience sample, basically the number of patients that conform to the inclusion and exclusion criteria from the two data sources. And based on those feasibility results, which I'll show in the power calcs that follow, the N required for each of the two cohorts was 20,000. And then for data analysis, categorical variables were we used a chi-squared test, and then for continuous variables, we used a student's t-test. So for the study size power calculations, to determine a mean detectable difference in the Charlson Comorbidity Index between, or for the mean, we did a t-test and found at the inflection point, as seen in the SAS output here, it's around 15 to 20,000 where it begins to level out at the 0.01 level. And as far as the categorical difference in CCI, so we had a cutoff point of 6. Patients that are much less, have a lower score than 6 are usually healthier. Those that are higher than 6 have less than 1 year according to their predictive mortality score. And so therefore we tried to determine that distinction by doing a Pearson chi-squared test for the mean detectable difference in the CCI score for those less than 6 and those greater than 6, and using different reference proportions of 0.8 and 0.6 to kind of cover a larger range to see if that would impact the the number of patients that would need to be examined in the two different cohorts. The inclusion and exclusion criteria for DR with DME are dependent on the ICD-9 codes. Essentially, each patient would have to have a code of 362.07 within 365 days, as well as a DR ICD-9 code, which conforms to 362.01 through 362.06. As for the other cohort, the DR without DME, the inclusion criteria essentially was two different occurrences of DR ICD-9 codes. Again, those 362.01 through 6. We also didn't want any previous anti-vascular endothelial growth factor treatment. Essentially, the patients had never received ranibizumab or other comparable products from competitors in that time frame, in that 365 days from the initial index point. For results, the two cohorts of patients that were identified fell between January 1st, 2007 and the first quarter of 2013. We had in excess of the 20,000. The convenience sample turned out to be 39,009 DR patients with DME and 45,480 patients with DR without DME. These two cohorts we found to be similar with respect to age, but when it came to sex, but when it came to age, DR patients with DME were older and had a higher CCI score. Patients with DME were also identified as having two or more Charlson-related comorbidities as compared to strictly DR patients without DME. That's summarized in this table, so we can see the p-value for the difference between the DME patients and the DR without DME. There is no statistically significant difference, whereas with age, the categories, as well as the mean difference between these two and the difference between these categories of 0 to 1 and 2 or more, there was a statistically significant difference. And from that, we can say that these results indicate that patients with MarketScan or from the MarketScan and Medicare supplemental databases are similar to patients with DR who do not have DME with respect to age, but those patients with DME were slightly older, had significantly higher comorbidity levels as seen through the CCI, and may actually represent a sicker patient population than patients with DR who do not have DME. As far as achievement of the project objectives, the 4 goals that I had laid out for this practicum was to develop this study. We had, as far as measures of success, a final protocol, statistical analysis plan, draft results, final results, and then a final report. We're sort of shopping around an abstract for publication or at least presentation at a conference at the moment. To conduct a community analysis on the medical affairs team, as I stated before, it's a lot of PharmDs and other medical science liaisons and physicians who may not have deep knowledge in statistics. And so it's kind of being that liaison, meeting with them, understanding what gaps in knowledge they had, and making several presentations and presenting to the team a number of resources so that they can read the publications and challenge the findings, at least the statistical findings that they have. To create that final poster is something that I'm working towards, and then eventually to go to a conference and present. And then getting up to speed, meeting weekly for an hour plus with an ophthalmologist at Genentech to understand the medical terminology, sitting in on these meetings and not fully grasping what sorts of studies they're hoping to investigate. It helped to have those meetings to come back with my notes to clarify points, understand the clinical questions better, and understand the relevance of the study I was performing. As far as competencies, there were 2 from the main track and 2 from my specific track. The general public health ones, the first one, GPH1, is a lit review. I had to perform an extensive lit review and feel confident in my ability to do so. GPH5, the second one listed here, involved intermediate level statistics. During the course of the practicum, I did over 60 hours in SAS, writing up macros, figuring out how to calculate that CCI index score based on over 100,000 patients, which each patient has many different entries. So there's hundreds of thousands of different rows of data to sift through in SAS. For the biostatistics and epidemiology track-specific competencies, advising other investigators in conducting data analysis, I did a lot of time in SAS and tried to, from the Power Calcs through to creating macros to creating the final tables of this analysis. There's a lot of time doing data analysis. And then BE2, serving as a data coordinator, pulling the data from the databases, knowing what data to actually extract from these databases, iterating on that to ensure that I had the two databases that I was pulling from and the 3 different locations, inpatient, outpatient, and services rendered, was helpful in determining, just having a holistic analysis. So again, that was another competency that I had to build out during this practicum. Contribution of MPH work. All of the statistics courses were highly valuable. Doing data analysis, having comfort, playing in SAS and looking up how to write the procedures that were required was invaluable. Other courses, I think it would be really helpful to have some other knowledge of clinical trials and the regulatory process. Yes, they were covered in different classes, but not to the point where I felt well equipped jumping in on the job and adding value, or at least tracking what they were saying. I think a dedicated class to something like this would probably benefit a lot of other students. I'd say my experience was 4 out of 5 stars. I don't know how else we were kind of rating it, but I think it's really hard to get time on people's schedules. There's 10,000 people at Genentech's campus. People are running in and out between meetings, and it makes for a lot of inefficiencies between buildings and getting people to sit down with you and actually talk through some really complicated subjects. I learned a lot of project management skills, a lot of soft skills. Genentech has this open floor design, so no one has a dedicated desk. So being comfortable walking up to a complete stranger, introducing yourself, and trying to get work done was, I mean, you have to be your own self-advocate to get the project moving forward. Yeah, I think I left with a much better appreciation for what it would require to get employment. Being in the Bay Area, I know that the bar is already high, but it just continues to get more and more difficult. And I think people are focused on staying competitive, and so making time to teach an intern is probably not on the top of a lot of people's lists. And I definitely felt the brunt of that, not necessarily from my practicum supervisor, but certainly from other people who needed to help me with my deliverable. It wasn't the top thing on their list, that was for sure. And so getting time and being understanding, knowing that I was not a priority, was definitely a hard pill to swallow, but thankfully everything came together. Yeah, I think having that strong advocate in my practicum instructor, having that was huge. He brought down barriers that otherwise would have thwarted all progress from being made. So I'm really thankful for having a good advocate and having someone who really had my interests at heart. Conclusions. So I did this as a rotational assignment. I am a full-time employee at Genentech, and had worked out with my manager to set aside the appropriate amount of time so that I could perform this practicum while working full-time. Balancing that while people are trying to continually pull you into your job was very difficult. As I said, I was running between buildings to keep it all together. I think I'll be very glad when I kind of close the book on this chapter on the end of the summer and the end of the practicum. Understanding like professional development, I kind of always had been pulled back into my previous job, and I've spent a lot of time taking this coursework and got endorsement from management to get this degree and kind of pursue a different opportunity. But it's hard because other people weren't the most supportive, so it's hard at least to hear from your peers. Again, I mentioned the intern stereotype and how people tend to be a bit more dismissive, but knowing that you're a full-time hire kind of helped a bit, but still it wasn't necessarily to their advantage to help me. I think there's also this fine line between showing competency and then overstating your abilities, saying like, "Hey, I'm a beginner at SaaS and not necessarily an intermediate user." People still, uh, even what a beginner is capable of doing for someone who may have a PhD in biostatistics is very different than someone who's taken a couple classes, such as an MPH grad. So I think getting up to speed, being clear about what you're capable of doing, being okay saying that you can't instead of getting flustered trying to deliver something you're incapable of doing was a real humbling experience for me. But at the same time, like at some point, you kind of throw your hat over the wall and pretend, not pretend, but make an effort to learn things that you may not know, and kind of going through it as you would with a problem set to figure out the answer. Sometimes you're surprised by what you learned and what you're capable of doing. So that's some of the conclusions, lessons learned on my practicum and how it went. Thanks again for listening in, and look forward to hearing your feedback.